Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's on My Mind. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and your comments are most welcome. Before I begin, I want to ask a question to our leaders. Whatever happened to honor, conscience, and country before self? I ask the questions because it seems most of our leaders are all sold out. They've sold their souls for a few measly dollars, and they have sold us right along with them. They have forged unreasonable alliances and unbeneficial agreements, all at the expense of our people. Well, as you know by now, territories are equipped with land, subsoil, seacoast, airspace, and territorial waters. So, the Caribbean and Africa are territories. Now, according to international law, there are 6 major ways in which territory can be acquired. 1. Terra nullius, by effectively occupying land that is unoccupied. 2. Incorporation, by occupying the whole or part of a country which has already been occupied and becoming part of that country. 3. Annexation, by taking over the country without the approval of those who occupy that country. Number 4. Succession, where a country is already part of a country but becomes independent of that country. Concession, where part of a country is under the administration of a foreign body. Number 6. Cession, by becoming part of an existing country through peacefully transferring ownership from one country to another with the consent of both countries. This can happen by an exchange of payment of money. Now, because cession applies directly to my topic today, I will dwell on it. 2 examples of cession, which is peacefully transferring ownership with an agreement via monetary exchange, are 1. The Louisiana Purchase, where the United States paid France $15 million for the state of Louisiana. Yes, the United States actually paid France $15 million to acquire the state of Louisiana. 2. The purchase of Alaska, where Russia sold out to the United States. Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. Now, there are other examples, but I do not have time to go into all of them right now. It would be very good for you if you would do the research yourself to find out the other examples. Instead, I will look at the Caribbean islands. Let us look at the Caribbean islands and Africa, which are a bit closer to home. Now, imagine China funneling billions of dollars into the Caribbean and Africa under the guise of economic aid or financial assistance for development. They are building hospitals, highways, racetracks, parliamentary residences, centers for the performing arts. They're renovating existing retail structures like markets, libraries, and so forth. They even want us to develop into Mandarin-speaking people. Yes, our governments are forcing us to study and speak Mandarin, the Chinese tongue. Why? Think on this. Of course, you would say that there's nothing wrong in studying or speaking Mandarin. It's good to be able to speak different languages. But there is a purpose for them wanting us to speak Mandarin. And your guess is just as good as mine. And call it an exaggeration if you will. But we are being forced to speak Mandarin because you know what's going to happen to us? We are going to be held captive by these Chinese. They will want us to speak their language because we will soon be their slaves. Now, I could hear some people saying, I rebuke that in Jesus' name. Listen, don't even bring Jesus into that. You understand me? Because Jesus ain't going to save you from what's about to happen to you. You see what I'm saying? So before you sit there and say, I rebuke that in Jesus' name and call me negative, think very carefully. Now, why does China have such a bona fide interest in our countries? Why is China, which is still developing, so keen on helping us to develop? Some might be quick to say, China is helping. Oh, the niceties of China, China's benevolence. Oh, isn't that sweet? China is helping everybody. What a good country. What a good nation. But have you ever thought about the cost of all that helping? Oh, the poor Caribbean and African countries. China is only lending a hand. Sadly, the very hand that is so eager to feed us will be the very hand to hold us in bondage. Because when a country or a state is sold, it includes the people. Are you there with me? Do you still think you're free? In olden days, one nation would invade another, steal, plunder, and enslave. Today, they have a more peaceful, deceitful way of acquiring that which do not belong to them. They pay monies to soulless, money-grubbing leaders who do not care anything for neither territory nor people. Yes, we have been sold and bought and continue to be sold and bought by way of cession, peacefully transferring through mutual agreements for monetary exchange. Our leaders are signing away our rights to life and liberty and our very lifeblood by way of the debts they are currently incurring by taking funding and loans from China. But you will say that China is not paying money to buy our countries. No, no, no. Okay. Maybe not so. But China is covertly paying for our countries by supplying loans and financial assistance, tokens of appreciation, and funding that our countries are not possibly able to pay back because we are in a nutshell broke. And only people without financial capabilities take loans and accept financial assistance to fill their needs. How does a broke man pay back a loan? Are you with me? Are you surprised that our leaders, those whom we have elected and given power to represent us, are now wielding that power over us and are selling their souls along with us? If that is not an abomination, what is it? The horror of it all, though, is that we are giving consent by remaining silent. We are not only silent, but we are condoning that behavior by applauding them for the efforts they are making to deprive us of what is ours. And by handing it over to a foreign concern, somehow we think that our governments are doing something really good for our countries and for us. Meanwhile, our leaders are committing crimes against humanity, our humanity. After all, the treaties and agreements that they are signing, when all of this is said and done, who will bear the brunt of that burden? Who? It will be our children, those who come after us, and their grandchildren, and their children, and their children's children. Do we seriously think we are paving a better way for those who succeed us? The greatest lie that we as Africans and Caribbean nations have been told. The greatest lie is that we have to be able to compete with more developed countries. Globalization. We need to get involved in globalization. Economic inclusivity. We cannot be left behind in this age of globalization. No. China's ambassador to Barbados, Wei Jing, stated that China is not interested in competing with other world powers in the Caribbean, but merely recognizes the Caribbean as colleagues of developing countries, and that China's only desire is to enhance the unity or the fellowship of fellow developing countries. According to Wei Jing, the affiliation between the Caribbean and China is an integral part of the strategy to enable the Caribbean countries to become an important element in the development of the world. There is something definitely wrong with indulging in globalization, and we have permitted ourselves to be suckered into the hype, a surefire way of becoming consumed by those who seem to have more money to burn. It is really called interdependence, not independence. You are not free to call your shots. You can't call your own shots. Let me explain. When you become globalized, what you're really doing is depending on another country for something, and they are dependent on you for something. In other words, as it stands, Africa and the Caribbean have become dependent on China for financial aid and for their development. China, in turn, is dependent on them for land, sea, and airspace. But instead of simply coming and say, hey, Caribbean and Africa, we need your land and we will pay a lump sum for it, as in the Louisiana Purchase or Alaska Purchase, that would be too glaring. They acquire our lands by surreptitious means. Economic aid, they call it. Financial assistance, they call it. Funding, they call it. Gifts, they call it. Here is a skillful form of deception. China encourages the Caribbean islands to break ties with Taiwan, otherwise known as the Republic of China, ROC, and to forge ties with China, better known as the People's Republic of China, PRC. And our credulous Caribbean leaders fall for that carefully crafted scheme. Are they gullible, or are they simply full of guile? Because Taiwan, Beijing, Taipei, Shanghai, Guangdong, Wuhan, China, all of them is China. China. I mean, don't our leaders know that? In 2005, Grenada received $55 million for a cricket stadium as a token of appreciation for Grenada breaking ties with Taiwan. Now, if that is not a prime example of bait and switch, tell me, what is it? As stated in a 2014 report by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, USCC, and I quote, Chinese companies since 2008 have been expanding since investments, contracted projects, and bilateral trade in the Caribbean. This has been enabled by China's central government, which since the early 2000s has increased its support for Chinese firms to invest overseas. It went on further to say, China's use of state-owned companies and state-sponsored financing allows Beijing to incorporate many economic activities into its diplomatic strategy in a way that most other countries cannot, unquote. Remember when I tell you Taiwan, Shanghai, Taipei, Beijing, all of them belong to China? China is the central government. So any agreements we make with Taiwan, any dealings we have with Taiwan, we automatically make these dealings with China. Don't be fooled. And these are some of the intricacies of diplomacy. China has placed its focus on the development of port facilities and highways. They also develop sports facilities and leisure advancements also they get involved in. They have built casinos, racetracks, hotels, resorts, you name it. China has done it and is doing it. For example, in Jamaica, China constructed a $720 million four-lane highway that stretches from the north to the south of the island. Ironically, Chinese workers were hired to build that highway. How is that beneficial to Jamaica and Jamaicans? Tell me. Number two, at this moment in time, the government of Jamaica has handed over the Kingston Freeport Terminal to China by way of a 30-year concession. The monetary worth is a whopping $814.78 million. Do the research. I'm not saying it from the top of my head. It is written. $600 million for Deep Sea Harbor, a highway, and a port in Suriname that will connect Suriname to Brazil. $462 million cash infusion in a beachfront known as Puerto Perla in the Dominican Republic. $17 million for a cricket stadium in Dominica. And $122 million in economic assistance to Dominica. $100 million purchase of majority shares in Omai Bauxite Mining from Guyana. $5.3 billion to Cayman Islands. $2.4 billion to the Bahamas to build the famous Bahama 3,800 room luxury resort with 5,000 Chinese nationals to work in the building of that hotel. As for St. Lucia, Pearl of the Caribbean they call her. My beautiful island, St. Lucia. $2.6 billion to build a racetrack, marina, resort, shopping mall, casino, free trade zone, and other entertainment facilities. Never mind the fact that we are inadequately equipped to handle equestrian activities. We have a racetrack. At what cost? Who's paying for that, and how are they going to pay for that? How are we going to pay for that? Then there is Barbados, Antigua, Trinidad and Tobago. Billions of dollars in Chinese funding. Nearly every island in the Caribbean has considerable investment from China. As for Africa, China has channeled substantial amount of money into Africa. Maybe not as much as the colonialist European countries, but enough. Enough to make one sit back and wonder. Enough for one to sit back and take notice. $60 billion into Nigeria alone is enough for concern. But according to Forbes Online, for China to be successful in its investment strategy in Africa, it will need to move from focusing its investment in natural resources and infrastructure to manufacturing, which is more labor intensive. Think, people, think. Forbes states, and I quote, a huge percentage of the continent's infrastructure initiatives are being driven by Chinese companies and or backed by Chinese funding. When we look at Africa, we see many countries chasing dreams of a better economic future while burying themselves in massive amounts of infrastructure-induced debt that they may not be able to actually afford. I didn't say it. Forbes said it. Now tell me, will the Caribbean be able to pay back their debt to China? Is Africa able to repay its obligation? It is apparent that leaders of both Africa and the Caribbean seem to be more concerned with the short-term goals of inviting China to funnel money into their countries without examining or considering the long-term effects of these so-called interest loans. Those so-called interest-free loans, concessional loans, those grants, and what I call stimulus packages. Nobody seems to be asking the hard question. What is China's end goal? Will its economic takeover become an eventual takeover? Who's asking the question and who's going to answer that question? The fellowship that China has spoken about, Beijing has spoken about, can it be achieved without becoming so intimately involved in our countries? In other words, is cession needed for the Caribbean to participate in globalization? Do they have to buy our country over through tricks? Why are our politicians selling us out and pretending it's business as usual? Why are we being handed over to China, hook, line, sinker, body and soul? As we as a people are too timid to even acknowledge this phenomenon. And because we fail to recognize the avarice of these government officials, we are failing to protect what quintessentially is our birthrights and our lands, our territory. When Europeans infiltrated Africa and pretended to build infrastructure for local economic development, their endgame was to rape the continent of its natural resources and to secure these resources for their own financial gains. And they did. Think of it. Have our leaders not yet learned? The big question I have to ask is, why do you, as a people, willingly go silently like sheep to the slaughter on account of some monetary rewards accepted by our rapacious, irresponsible, tunnel vision leaders? Do we honestly think that our leaders are doing what is best for us as a people and for our countries? Do we think that they have an honest desire for us to compete on the world stage? No. They're selling us out. They're selling our land out. And we are like cattle being sold together with our land, our water, our sea and airspace. And none of us will escape. For once men take no account for their souls, then neither will they take account for the well-being or the souls of others. What's important to them is that their positions of power, the positions that we allow them to enjoy, serve the purpose of only filling their pockets with money by any means necessary, bribes included. Will you continue to accept being sold out? Will you rage against the injustice? Or will you submit and hope for the best? You decide. To our leaders, I remind them in the words of Canadian scientist Orlando Aloysius Batista: an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. Tanzania's president has called a 2013 agreement with China exploitative. He declares that the renting of a port for 99 years, which gives Tanzania zero authority to determine who else can invest in the port once it is operational, is an abuse of power on China's part. And he is having no part of it. No deal, he said. At least one leader is waking up to the craftiness of China and is being very vocal about it. He deserves to be applauded. Are there any other leaders who are willing to correct the errors they might have willfully committed and save our posterity a whole lot of grief? You decide. Thanks for listening. Until next time, see ya.